I'm glad you're joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you from Atlanta in April of 2022. Today, we're going to be talking about the outbreak of bird flu, which is causing the premature deaths of millions of birds, including wild birds, but especially domesticated birds on industrial egg farms. Since US factory farms are conducting horrific mass killings of tens of millions of birds exposed to the virus. Unlike most news stories that focus on this from a human, economic, or agricultural perspective, we're going to be talking about it from the perspective of those who are most affected and are suffering painful deaths, the birds themselves. And we'll talk about the ways these grotesque mass killings are being conducted. My guest is Lori Torgerson-White, an animal welfare scientist and research director at Farm Sanctuary. Farm Sanctuary is one of my favorite nonprofits. For over 35 years, they have fought the disastrous effects of animal agriculture on animals, the environment, social justice, and public health through farmed animal rescue, education, and advocacy. They envision a world where sanctuary replaces exploitation. Their website is farmsanctuary.org. It has gorgeous photos of cows, chickens, sheep, turkeys, and pigs who reside at their sanctuaries. Lori Torgerson-White is an animal welfare scientist and research director at Farm Sanctuary, where she works with the sanctuary residents, designing and implementing research to understand more about the inner lives of farmed animals. Before coming to Farm Sanctuary, Lori was director of research and lead animal welfare specialist at the nonprofit Mercy for Animals. She holds a Master of Science in Zoology from Michigan State University, where she studied animal personality. Prior to her work with Mercy for Animals, she worked to improve the lives of captive animals as the first research analyst at the Center for Zoo Animal Welfare at the Detroit Zoo. She has authored peer-reviewed publications on animal welfare, personality, and cognition, taught university-level biology and nutrition courses, and traveled all over the world visiting farms to better understand the needs of farmed animals. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you, Carrie. It's great to be here.
Well, the bird flu has hit the USA again, and it's killing wild and domesticated birds. Can you tell us what you know about the recent outbreak and how it compares to outbreaks in the past?
Yeah, so this recent outbreak, the strain that is currently sweeping through the country is H5N1. This is a highly pathogenic avian influenza. As of the April 19th was the last time I checked the stats, there were 202 cases in domesticated birds in 29 states. That would be over 30 states if we considered the detections in wild birds as well. Thus far, over 28 million birds have been infected, and what the industry calls depopulated, or as you have mentioned, mass killings have been conducted to wipe out those populations. So this is the worst outbreak since the 2014-2015 outbreak. During that time, there were 232 cases in domesticated flocks. So it's possible that this year we could outpace the 2014-2015 outbreak. And this year, the outbreak is primarily hitting the egg industry. So it's chickens raised for eggs, it's also hitting turkeys and backyard flocks, but isn't hitting chickens who are raised for meat as much.
Okay. And could you tell us how the bird flu or avian influenza affects birds? Like, is it often fatal?
It is often fatal. Yeah, the mortality rates are really high. I've seen anywhere from 60% to 100% mortality rates. Wow. The way it affects the birds, the symptoms that they exhibit are often respiratory symptoms like gasping and nasal discharge. They'll have digestive symptoms like extreme diarrhea. They will have swelling around the head, neck, and eyes. Their head and legs might end up with a purple discoloration. And then often rapid and sudden death is how the birds experience it. So it's an awful disease.
So it's not just the same as us getting the flu or something, it sounds like.
No, it's a lot more serious than us getting the flu. Yeah, and even, in the cases where it has jumped to humans, it's also a lot more serious in humans.
Wow. Okay. So even though we're using the term bird flu or influenza. It's a much more kind of virulent strain than we
Absolutely.
used to. Okay.
Yeah, real quick, I won't go too
Yeah.
deep into this, but there are two different kinds of avian influenza. There's the highly pathogenic avian influenza, which is what we're dealing with right now. And then there's low pathogenic avian influenza, which is going to be something more similar to a flu that we might just, we feel a little bit sick and then we get better.
Yeah.
And so that also does circulate in the domesticated bird population. But this one is the one that's much more serious.
Right. And I've heard news reports of US animal agribusinesses killing off, or they might use the government euphemism, depopulating their whole flock of birds, which is in the thousands or sometimes millions per factory farm. And this has collectively led to the killing of over 25 million farmed birds so far in the US, particularly chickens exploited in the egg industry. If the birds at their farming warehouses are exposed to bird flu, why do the factory farmers decide to have all their birds killed as opposed to testing the birds and then treating any individual who's sick?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So first I want to point out that it actually isn't the farmers who make the decision.
Okay.
The government, so state and federal authorities, require farmers and animal agriculture companies to report cases of avian influenza. And then what actually happens is that the authorities will require those birds to be killed, and USDA representatives will actually come out to the farms and perform those mass killings themselves. So, this is a situation where it really isn't the farmer at fault. Honestly, it's the system that is at fault in this case. And so speaking of systems, the reason why, let's pretend that that wasn't the case and that the farmer could decide just to treat some of the birds who are sick. The system is set up in such a way that the farmer has to have thousands or tens of thousands of birds together in a shed in order to make any profit, to be able to support their families. And so the conditions that the birds are kept in at these really high numbers, really high stocking densities, there's very little genetic variance within the population of birds, which means that all of the birds are all, pretty much equally susceptible to the virus. The conditions are often unsanitary as a result of keeping that many animals in a confined space. And so when you have a situation like that, if you do have, a handful of birds who get sick, it's going to spread really quickly just because of the system that they're in, the situation that they're in.
Right.
So even if they were able to choose to isolate individuals, it would be almost impossible to test all of those birds often enough or watch for symptoms often enough to be able to isolate those birds and before the virus was able to spread. And then given the current regulations regarding the mass killing of birds who have avian influenza, there's really no incentive to develop a treatment. So we don't actually, as far as I know, have a treatment, even if we were able to, isolate and treat birds. And so
like we've worked on the COVID vaccine so hard for us, but there's not a lot of vaccines for these bird flus.
Yeah, they have actually been working on those vaccines, I think, for decades. But my understanding is that, similar to the flu vaccine in humans, where the flu virus mutates really quickly. So every year, we have different levels of effectiveness of the flu vaccine.
Right.
That's my understanding as well. If, as they've been trying to develop a vaccine for highly pathogenic avian influenza, it's really hard to target the right variant. And so they haven't had success in the way that they would have hoped yet.
And so some of the reasons that all the birds are killed is pragmatic because there's physically too many birds to kind of separate them out and all of that. But would you say that the USDA or the industry's decision to kill the whole flock who's been exposed to a virus is really ultimately for economic reasons, rather than saying that, oh, we're killing them all as a humane attempt to put sick birds out of their misery?
Yeah, I think it's both. I will say, I think that the whole system needs to change. And rather than, killing millions of birds who are sick and are suffering. And so, there is something to say about the suffering that they experience as a result of avian influenza. The reality is also that this virus is very dangerous. If it's allowed to spread like wildfire, then new variants can arise in that domesticated bird population. And there's always the chance that those new variants can jump to humans, it's a zoonotic disease, so they can jump to humans. And if a variant has arisen that is able to achieve human to human transmission, that could cause the next pandemic.
So some of it is a public, like the USDA also potentially sees it as a public health issue, why the birds can't be slaughtered and sold for meat or eggs.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, as far as I know, there's actually no chance of getting avian influenza from eating a chicken who had avian influenza, but there is the problem of just letting this disease spread throughout the population and then have new variants come up. And if it jumps to humans, then it could be problematic. I should tell you, so Farm Sanctuary has worked on this issue a bit. So if we go back again to the 2015 avian flu outbreak, 50 million chickens and turkeys were killed in order to contain the spread of the disease. Hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars went to reimbursing companies for that mass killing. And so rather than, after that, we experienced that, what was that, 7 years ago now? Instead of developing a plan to prevent that from happening again, the USDA instead has continued to encourage the status quo and continued to encourage these farms to confine animals in these stressful, overcrowded conditions where this disease is going to spread. And so Farm Sanctuary has joined forces with the Humane Society of the United States and Mercy for Animals to challenge the USDA by bringing forth a federal lawsuit that would require the USDA to consider a plan to prevent another avian flu outbreak by tying these federal funds to the adoption of production systems that would give the birds more space and reduce the likelihood of a disease outbreak. So there is something that can be done differently here, and economics absolutely are a part of the problem here. It's a multifaceted problem.
And how do factory farmers or the industry, how do they, or USDA, I guess, how do they kill the birds at their farm or facility when they can't send them to the slaughterhouses? Like if the birds have been exposed to the bird flu, because I know that's where a lot of the controversy comes in, is like, oh, okay, well, you've got, tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of animals, and now they all need to be killed at the same time. What are some of the ways that they do this?
Yeah, there are three main ways this is done. They all result in extreme suffering for the animals. The first way is called whole house gassing. This one is going to be really common with in the egg industry. And what happens in this case is that they sort of seal up the house or the shed that the birds are kept in, and then they pump carbon dioxide into the shed until it reaches a lethal level. It's usually somewhere around like 60% carbon dioxide is the level at which it will kill the birds. And so that will take about like the time to death there can be almost 10 minutes. It's really aversive for the bird.
That's akin, if I'll just use my own language, to a gas chamber, like a poisoning.
It is.
Okay.
Yes. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. Right. Extremely aversive to the birds. I've seen birds who are being killed using CO2 in the past. And as they start to notice the CO2, they start gasping. They start to sort of what looks to me like panicking, flapping their wings. It's an awful way to die.
Yeah.
So that's one way. The second way is using water-based foam. So what they do is they actually spray firefighting foam into the barn. This is going to be something that would be used more often if you have chickens who are raised for meat, because they're all on the floor of the barn.
Right.
And so they will spray the foam into the barn until it covers the chickens. And so it essentially drowns them.
Is it
And
just water or is there some kind of toxin in the foam?
it's firefighter foam. It's not just water, it's water-based,
Okay.
but there are other chemicals in it as well. But there's nothing in the foam, like there aren't chemicals in the foam that will kill the birds. It's really they're dying of asphyxiation.
Oh,
Yeah.
yuck.
So obviously also horrible, like both of these are ways that as humans, we think about, different ways you could die. And these are both awful ways to die in a gas chamber, like you said, or
drowning.
drowning essentially. Yeah. And so that will take almost 5 minutes to kill the birds once they are experiencing that. The third way, so these first two ways clearly are horrible, but the third way is even more horrible than the other two. And it's called ventilation shutdown. And so it's abbreviated VSD plus. So it's ventilation shutdown plus. And what happens here is that if you have a chicken shed, and you're trying to keep the birds alive, you have to keep the temperature at, a comfortable temperature for the birds. So you have a ventilation system that's going to keep the temperature at, whatever, 70, 72 degrees or something like that. And so in this case, what happens is that they seal up the house, turn off the ventilation system, and then will pump in, turn on the heat and potentially pump in carbon dioxide, although my understanding is that that happens less often because it's more expensive. And sometimes there are carbon dioxide shortages. And so in this case, it can take up to 4 hours for the birds to die in this case, and they're essentially dying of hyperthermia.
Are they like sweating to death? Like you're being baked almost?
They're being baked, yes. It would be like dying in a car that has been
like being trapped in a heated car.
on a hot day.
Yeah, with the windows up, like greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
And so that's the main way that this is happening right now, is this ventilation shutdown of like the egg warehouses.
Yes, I've seen quite a few news reports where different companies are saying that this is the method that they're using.
Yeah.
And it's the one that is the most controversial. There was just recently an expose done by an organization called Animal Outlook, where they released a video that they had obtained via government requests, FOIA requests, of some university research that was funded by the poultry industry to look at VSD. And so the footage actually shows a chicken in this container being exposed to the conditions of VSD. And it actually took the hens so if it was VSD, so if ventilation shut down alone in that, very controlled environment, it took 91 minutes for the hens to die. When you added the heat, it took 54 minutes to die. So that's, and then when you actually research that's been done on this in an actual commercial setting where you have lots and lots of birds, not just the one in this small container, is hours is how long it's taking. So, if anyone is interested in looking at, I would say if any of this is sparking anything in any of the listeners on, the ethics of this industry, and you want more information about what's happening right now to millions of birds in this country, that Animal Outlook expose is a good place to get.
Yeah, I'm going to link that on the Facebook page for In Tune to Nature, that Animal Outlook expose. If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature. I'm host Carrie Freeman, talking with Lori Torgerson-White, an animal welfare scientist and director of research at Farm Sanctuary. We're discussing the bird flu outbreak in the United States from the standpoint of how it affects the birds, since most people who cover bird flu in the news don't talk about it from the perspective or interest of the actual birds who are being killed en masse. So, Lori, is there anything farmers or the USDA could possibly do to reduce suffering when tens or hundreds of thousands of birds on a single industrial farm are supposed to be immediately killed? Or does the farming situation have to change because they can't respond to crises in any humane way because of the fact that the birds are so crowded.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the latter, really. The system is, I mean, it's working as it was designed, but it's oppressive to everyone involved. You know, our industrial agriculture system is oppressive to the animals. It's oppressive to the farmers. It's oppressive to the slaughterhouse workers. It's oppressive to rural communities. It's oppressive to the environment. And so we've created this situation where, you know, you have so many animals packed into such a tight space and unsanitary conditions. You know, in most cases, these animals are in barren barns with no access to natural light. Oftentimes, in the case of the egg industry, they're packed into battery cages, like 6 to 10 hens in one small cage where they aren't able to express any of their natural behaviors. And so the reality is that if a virus gets into a barn, it's going to spread. And so the answer is to change the whole system. That is which is a daunting task, but it's where we have to go, and we have to start to take baby steps in that direction.
Right. Like, because whenever I see news coverage, whether if it's hurricanes or wildfires, floods and all different things, when any kind of crisis arises, or in this case, diseases, industrial farming does not seem like it can ensure welfare for individual animals, because there's hundreds or thousands of animals under their quote unquote care at any time. And so they often just get abandoned, and it's just some kind of insurance write-off, or the taxpayers have to just pay for it. And they start again with a new kind of herd or flock of animals. So as much as they want to talk about welfare and everything, there's just too many, especially in the climate crisis, there's just too many extreme events. And when that happens, it just seems like they cannot care for individuals. So, I mean, to me, it's just all talk about animal welfare.
Yeah, they aren't set up to care for individuals. And animal welfare is an individual concept. But the reality is that, you know, when the industry is talking about welfare, they're all often talking about health. First of all, they're not, you know, animal welfare is a holistic concept, which is going to include the emotional experience of the animal, the physical health of the animal, and the ability to engage in, you know, natural behaviors. But when the industry is talking about welfare, they are usually primarily talking about health. And they're talking about health to the extent that they can get these animals to slaughter.
Right. Like, I'm keeping them alive so that I could kill them for money.
Right.
So yeah, that's right. Yeah. Right. That's not any kind of welfare that I want kind of pointed towards myself. Now, I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to briefly add this in, because of course we're in the middle, or hopefully not the middle, but of our COVID pandemic. And so we've learned about zoonotic diseases. And then you touched on this before, but that we humans should be concerned also about bird flu, because this avian influenza could spread to our own species, right?
And it has. I mean, it has before. So the most recent data that I've seen out of the CDC are that there have been, since 2003, there have been more than 700 human infections with H5N1 around the world. And that of those 700 human infections, 60% of the cases that have been identified, those people have died. And so if this, like I said earlier, if this virus were able to mutate in such a way that it was not only able to jump to humans, which it's already done, but also to achieve that human to human transmission, which is what we have going on with COVID right now. It's why we wear masks. It's why we social distance, you know, it's why we're on Zoom all the time. If that happens, so if we have the virus jump to humans and achieve human to human transmission, it could be a catastrophic, beyond what we can imagine, pandemic. And so, you know, there are lots of scientists, there are, you know, health organizations that will say that avian influenza is a huge risk. With avian influenza has huge pandemic potential, and so we have to be more cautious.
Yeah, I mean, right. And that's another reason to bring this up right now in the middle of a pandemic, is that we're focusing a lot on how to recover, but not enough on prevention. So just as to wrap up in like 30 seconds, if people wanted to help farmed animals or help deal with if they're upset about what they're hearing about the egg and poultry industry here, how can they connect with animal advocacy efforts that your organization Farm Sanctuary is working on?
Yeah, so we have a website, it's farmsanctuary.org. There's an action center there where folks can look at supporting a number of different issues that we're actively working on. We're on all the different social media platforms, so there, you can find us in any of those places. I'd recommend that if this is sparking something in you, that you can think about, whether you want to continue supporting a system like this, and think about starting to make small changes in your own life that can help you to better align with your own ethical perspective on these things.
Right. That's why I've been vegan for over 20 years, because I don't want to pay for this. I don't like that my taxpayer money goes towards this, but I can't help that. But well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Lori Torgerson-White, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. Thank you for the work that you do and your colleagues at Farm Sanctuary promoting farmed animal rights and welfare.
Thank you so much, Carrie. It was great talking with you.
Yeah, take care. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. We post action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, facebook.com/intune-to-nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species like birds and chickens. Thank you for listening. Cheers.